State your name for the record, please.
It's William Raymond Morgan.
Can you briefly describe for us your educational background, sir?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from North Georgia College and a Ph.D. in chemistry from the University of Georgia.
Can you briefly describe for us your work experience, including military experience, from the time you completed your education to 1992?
I received my Ph.D. in 1970. I was on delayed entry on active duty in the Army because when I went to a military school, North Georgia College was a military school, and I was commissioned in the Army in 1965 when I graduated there, and I had a delay on entry to active duty. So upon completion of my doctoral work, I entered the Army and served from 1970 to 72, and I was stationed in Charlottesville, Virginia, as a member of the United States Army's Foreign Science and Technology Center, and we were responsible for scientific and technical intelligence work. Upon my completion of my military service, which was in March of 1972, I had obtained a position with Marlboros, and at the end of March began work with Marlboros as an analytical chemist in the Analytical Research Division. I worked in that division until 1984, and in February of 1984 I transferred to the Biochemical Research Division, and I was in that division until I was released from Philip Morris in 1992.
Why did you transfer over to the Biochemical Research Division?
I requested it.
And why did you make that request?
Work that I was doing with an Analytical Research Division with trace metal analysis in putting together my plans for the research that I wanted to do for 1984. Management had decided that they did not want to pursue that area of research. They suggested that it might be more appropriate for that research to be done in the Biochemical Research Division. I contacted the manager of Biochemical Research and met with him. That was Jim Charles at the time. He was not interested in pursuing that research, but suggested that he had an opening in the nitrosamine group, and if I would be interested in that. And I said that I would be interested, and the transfer occurred shortly thereafter.
This was in 1984. Do you remember the month?
February.
And in February of 1984, did you pretty much immediately go over to the nitrosamine group?
Yes.
What was the nitrosamine group?
It was a group within the Biochemical Research Division that were studying nitrosamines.
And who were members of that group?
The project leader at the time was Sue Tafur, T-A-F-U-R, and Jim Charles was the manager, and there were approximately 7 or 8 other members that were chemists within the group, chemists or technicians within the group.
What is a nitrosamine?
It's a secondary amine that has a NO group attached to the nitrogen in the amine.
And when you say NO group attached to the nitrogen in the amine, what are you referring to? What does the NO group mean?
It's a nitrogen oxide group, and it's bonded. There's a nitrogen-nitrogen bond between the amine and the NO group.
And do you know how these nitrosamines are formed in cigarette or tobacco smoke?
The chemistry of how they're formed, or they're formed in two ways. In the growing of tobacco, nitrosamines are formed during either the growing and the curing process. And these are referred to as, or we refer to them as endogenous nitrosamines. And those were what we refer to as tobacco-specific nitrosamines because their their origin for the organic group were the alkaloids that were in tobacco. During the smoking of tobacco, there are additional nitrosamines of the same type. There are really three major ones. NNN, referred to as NNN, NAT, and NNK. Those three, there's additional quantities that are formed during the actual combustion of the cigarette, and we refer to those as pyrosynthetically formed.
Pyrosynthetically formed?
Right, because they're formed during the combustion of the cigarette.
Okay, starting with NNN, what is that an acronym for?
Nitroso-nornicotine.
And NAT?
Is nitroso-anatobine.
And NNK?
Do you want the full name?
Yes.
It's 4. I'll think about this. 4 dash parentheses methyl nitrosamino close parentheses dash 1 dash open parentheses 3-pyridyl close parentheses dash 1 dash butanol. NNK is a very good word. There's not an alkaloid like nitroso-nornicotine is formed from nornicotine, and nitroso-anatobine is formed from anatobine. But there's not a corresponding alkaloid for NNK. It has been reported in the literature that it is that precursor is formed from nicotine. But it's not a direct, if you just add nicotine to tobacco and try to increase the level of NNK, you don't observe an increase. So there's some intermediate processes, chemical reactions that occur to produce the precursor for NNK.
Are you familiar with the research concerning whether nitrosamines are carcinogenic compounds?
I'm familiar with what's in the literature.
And what does the literature say?
Literature says that in studies on mice, laboratory animals, that they are very potent carcinogens, in particular NNN and NNK.
Now, NNN and NNK and NAT all are formed during the smoking of tobacco? Is that correct?
Formed during the growing of tobacco, either the growing process and curing process, and they're also formed during the burning of the cigarette, during the combustion of the cigarette.
Is one more or less volatile than the other, or do you know?
NNK is a little more volatile than the others, to the best of my recollection. I did some studies on decomposition temperatures for the various nitrosamines. And the best of my recollection, NNK had the lowest decomposition temperature, which would indicate that it was potentially maybe a little more volatile.
Now, does the age of the smoke have anything to do with the level of volatility of the nitrosamines?
What smoke are we talking about?
Side stream smoke.
Does it have any?
Does it have any relationship to the level of volatility of the side stream smoke, the age of the side stream smoke?
I don't like to use the word volatility. I would just say the amount of nitrosamine that's in the aged smoke. NNK is higher in aged smoke than it is in fresh smoke, which is collected directly off a cigarette.
And how do you know that?
I did studies.
What studies did you do?
There was a chamber that was constructed. We refer to it as side stream chamber. It was reconstructed. One was built in Richmond in the late 1980s. They had previously, and I presume still exists, one that was built in Switzerland at the research facility in Neuchâtel, where they studied the aging of smoke and studied a number of different parameters. But it was noted in the studies that were done there that NNK levels tended to increase with time as the smoke aged. The other nitrosamines tended to stay essentially the same as they were in fresh smoke or slightly decline as the smoke aged.
Now, as far as research on side stream smoke, did you do any other research related to side stream smoke, tobacco smoke?
Other than the quantitative measurements of fresh and aged side stream, no.
Now, when this research was conducted, did you use actual cigarettes to do the research?
We used reference cigarettes.
What is a reference cigarette?
There were generally two kinds. There were one that was referred to as a Kentucky reference cigarette, which was available to all tobacco companies to be used throughout the industry. And then we had a group at Philip Morris referred to as SemiWorks, which was a facility that they could make cigarettes to order, so to speak, and we could request to have cigarettes made of in just about any configuration that we wanted them. And we would have, if we wanted to say, do measurements on a cigarette that was like a Marlboro, we would have them make a cigarette that was like a Marlboro but wasn't actually a Marlboro because it wouldn't have, say, the flavors added to it and what have you, but it would have the same paper, essentially the same blend, same filter, what have you, and we would refer to that as a reference cigarette.
And when you say the additives, the flavorings weren't added into it, how do you know that?
Because we requested that they not be added.
Okay, what was the reason for requesting that the flavorings and the additives not be added?
Because if they were going to do that, then we could just get production cigarettes off the line, and we were told not to do nitrosamine studies on production cigarettes.
Who told you not to do nitrosamine studies on production cigarettes?
Management?
Do you have specific names that you can recollect?
No.
Was it more than one person in management who said this?
It was, when I came on board with the nitrosamine project, it was told to us at that point it was already, I guess, a standing order for the people that were already working on the project, and that it was just passed on to me that when we did any studies, we did them on a reference cigarette and not on a production cigarette.
nitrosamine research group in existence prior to the time you were there, if you know?
I don't know exactly. It started, I know, probably at least a couple of years prior to my joining.
And did you begin doing research on nitrosamines immediately upon starting over there in February of 1984?
Yes, I did.
And the instruction that you were given not to use production cigarettes, that was made clear to you immediately upon beginning that job?
The first part of the work that I did was actually learning the procedures that were in place for the collection and the analysis. And in that case, we were just using reference cigarettes. But then when it was time for me to start actually designing experiments to study, I was told that we would not use production cigarettes, but we'd use reference cigarettes.
Did you ask why?
No.
Well, the research that was done on non-production cigarettes, was that, well, how was that done? What was well, by that I mean, I should explain further, what was the procedure for putting together all the research and for keeping track of the research, for keeping notations on the research?
As far as notations on the research, any work we did, it was recorded in a laboratory notebook. As far as the cigarettes themselves and the design of experiments, a lot of the experiments we did not have production cigarettes that matched the parameters we needed to measure. If we wanted to, say, study construction parameters, we would make cigarettes with varying types of filters, or varying types of paper, or varying circumferences, or various types of fillers. Say it may be a single type, like a burley, rather than the blend. So those types of cigarettes were not production cigarettes, so we had to have them made separate.
So were that kind of research done for the purpose, well, let me just put it another one. What was the purpose of that type of research, if you know?
To understand the basis of the origin of nitrosamines, to see how burley different from bright, different from original, say, to see how if the combustion parameters, if there was a change in, say, the relationship to the circumference of the cigarette with the packing density of the filler, the type of paper that was on it, if it had an impact on. There were a lot of parameters that you had cigarettes that were made to address the particular parameter you were looking for.
Aside from measuring those type of parameters for that purpose, were there any other purposes to doing the research that the nitrosamine research group did?
We monitored the literature, and if information was reported, say, with reference to a different analysis procedure or whatever, we would duplicate that procedure to see if it gave the same results that the procedure that we were using for analysis. We also were studying, trying to get a better knowledge of, especially with the pyrosynthetically produced nitrosamines, how they were produced, and were there ways to prevent that formation. We also looked at the correlations for the formation of the endogenous nitrosamines as to what parameters might contribute to their formation, and also to ways that we might treat or process the tobacco to lower those levels.
During the course of the research, did the group or you or anyone in the group ever measure the nitrosamine level, just measured the amount of nitrosamine in a given cigarette, whether it be non-production or production?
Can you repeat that?
Did anyone in your group, ever measure the nitrosamine level in either a non-production cigarette or a production cigarette?
We did it all the time.
Why did you do that?
How do we measure the level of nitrosamine? That was the objective of the project was to study the levels of nitrosamine.
When you studied the levels of nitrosamine in, for example, a non-production cigarette that was like a Marlboro, from a scientific standpoint, was that the best way to study the nitrosamine level of a Marlboro itself?
No. It would be a way of studying levels that existed in smoke, either mainstream or side stream, for that particular construction parameter. Being a blend that was similar to Marlboro, type of paper, type of filter, etc. We would also have a reference cigarette or one made in semi-works that would be similar to, say, a Virginia Slims, or maybe one that was similar to a Cambridge, or that had a very high filtration, or a different type of dilution in the paper. And it was just...
When you, for example, would do a cigarette, look at a cigarette that was like a Marlboro, did you actually get nitrosamine level readings on cigarettes that were supposed to be like Marlboro but not actually Marlboros?
I don't know, because we didn't run Marlboro. I don't know what the levels were.
Let me rephrase. Did you ever test a cigarette that was considered to be like a Marlboro?
We studied cigarettes that had essentially the same blend, paper, filter, delivered the same TPM level, nicotine, as close to a Marlboro as possible. And the only difference essentially would be that it didn't have the flavor components in it.
And what was your understanding of the purpose of measuring the nitrosamine level in a cigarette that was like a Marlboro?
It was just one of the many types of configurations that we studied.
Go ahead.
It would be when you say like a Marlboro, I mean that's Marlboro's the best-selling cigarette in the world, and so other cigarettes that R.J. Reynolds makes and other companies all had similar cigarettes that were similar to the Marlboro as far as delivery of tar and nicotine, and I would guess that if you take those cigarettes from all the companies and put them together, they constitute the majority of all the cigarettes that are sold. And so studying a cigarette that was similar in configuration to that cigarette would be something that would be most like what you would generally encounter in the world.
When did you first begin doing or participating in the research that would do nitrosamine level measurements of cigarettes like Marlboro or like Cambridge or like Virginia Slims or any of the other brands?
Almost immediately upon joining the nitrosamine group. You had a Kentucky reference cigarette that was a filtered cigarette that was essentially like a Marlboro.
missing from it?
It might have a slightly different vapor. It might have, wouldn't have any flavor additives, but it would produce essentially the same filtration efficiency and the same TPM and nicotine delivery as a Marlboro or Winston, or it would be in that ballpark. These cigarettes we use, especially the Kentucky reference cigarettes, were used industry-wide. They were used by, I guess, just about every research project within Philip Morris, and I presume other companies are studying a whole host of different types of studies that were going on.
Did you ever have occasion to actually test a production cigarette?
Yes.
And how did that happen?
It was in the side stream chamber and the aging of side stream smoke. We had initially set the chamber up so that the smoking machine would use a reference cigarette that was similar to Marlboro, and there had been a request by someone, I don't know who, to run a cigarette that was longer and slimmer. It represented, it was akin to a Virginia Slim, and there needed to be modifications to the smoking machine because it was remote controlled, and the inserts in the smoking machine that actually held the cigarette needed to be changed, and also the the loading parameters where the cigarette was actually loaded and lit. Those mechanical changes had to be made to the smoking machine, and in making and running those tests set up to do the experiments, we were still collecting information when runs were made to develop the database for nitrosamines in environmental tobacco smoker and ACE side stream smoker, I guess that's referred to. And we knew that run was being made, that they were going to run a different cigarette other than the ones we had been running, and nitrosamines were collected, and they were given an eco-analysis. And I didn't know what the cigarette was at the time that I did the analysis.
And when you did the analysis, what result did you find?
I found a very high level of NNK in the ACE side stream.
NNK being a nitrosamine that's more volatile than the others, is that correct?
Well, I hate to use the word volatile, but yes.
And what word would you use instead?
Volatility generally, to me, refers to its distillation into a gas phase. I would prefer just to use the word transfer. It was transferred from tobacco into the smoke stream, rather than. I would like to say that it was this volatility that caused that. It could be because of the pyrosynthetic production. It could be a reaction process that produced a high level in that.
And how much higher was the nitrosamine level in the Virginia Slim cigarette?
It was about approximately 10 times higher than we had measured with our reference cigarettes.
And when you said 10 times higher, can you quantify that?
The NNK, I'm referring now to NNK. I don't like to speak of nitrosamines as a group, but relative, I prefer to speak of individual nitrosamines. NNK in, say, mainstream smoke would be approximately 75 to 100 nanograms per cigarette. In fresh side stream smoke that's collected just immediately right off the cigarette, it would increase to approximately 200 to 400, depending on what your blend was. So it averaged approximately about 300 nanograms per cigarette. When you aged in the chamber, on the aged smoke, it would go up, the NK would increase to approximately 1,200 to 1,500 nanograms per cigarette. And what we measured on this particular run, I was getting approximately 12,000 nanograms per cigarette.
And when you say aged, how much age is added?
We would do the smoking, which would take about 10 minutes. Then a fan would be turned on in the room to blend and get a uniform distribution of smoke in the room, which would take probably a couple of minutes. And then collection procedures would start, and we would collect for an hour. So at most, it was, say, an hour and 12, 15 minutes. So but we collected over that whole hour, so some of it was collected when it was only maybe 15 minutes old, and some of it was collected when it was an hour and 15 minutes old.
Okay, so when you saw this level of 12,000 nanograms, what, if anything, did you do?
I was very surprised to see it, and I compiled the data from the that I had recorded off of the integrators on the detectors, and I took the data and showed it to my section leader, Robin Kinser.
And what, if anything, did Robin Kinser do?
She asked me what cigarette it was.
And what did you tell her?
Told her I did not know. I only had a code, a run code from the chamber.
And did you provide her with the code, the run code?
It was written on the notes, yes.
And after you told her that, what, if anything, did you do?
Robin called Roger Combs, who was in charge of the chamber, and inquired as to what cigarette that was for that run. And I was sitting there, and after she finished talking to him, she told me that it was a Virginia Slims.
Well, I'm going to object to the last part of that answer is without foundation.
Robin, who told you it was a Virginia Slims?
Robin Kinser.
And who was Robin?
She was the section leader.
She was your supervisor?
One of them. I had a project leader, and then there was a section leader, which was kind of like an assistant manager.
Okay. She was a manager for Philip Morris?
Like an assistant manager, yes.
And she told you it was a Virginia Slims?
She told me that's what Roger told her it was.
Same objection.
And who was Roger?
He was the person who was in charge of the operation of the aging chamber and coordinating all the experiments that were done in that chamber.
And was he a management level employee at Philip Morris?
I think you would refer to him as a project leader. So that was, yes, I guess, a low-level management position.
He supervised other people at Philip Morris?
Yes, he did.
And after it was discovered that this was a Virginia Slim cigarette, what, if anything, happened?
Informal question.
She said that she needed to discuss that with the manager of the biochemical research, which was Cathy Ellis.
It's spelled C-A-T-H-Y? Cathy?
C.
Cathy Ellis. And did she discuss this with Cathy Ellis?
She called her on the phone, asked could she see her, and she left the office and told me that that's where she was going.
And who told you that's what she was doing?
Kinser told me she was going to talk to Cathy.
And then what happened, as far as you know?
She left. I presume she went to talk to Cathy. I went back to my office, my desk.
And did anyone communicate with you further about this finding of yours?
Yes.
Who?
Robin.
And when did she do that?
She came back, that's my recollection, about a half an hour later, and told me that Cathy had said to destroy the data, and that in the future we were not to run, reminded me that we were not to run nitrosamines on production cigarettes, and also told me that she was going to remind Roger Combs that if he was going to run production cigarettes in the side stream chamber, that he was not to collect nitrosamines.
If he was going to run side stream smoke on production cigarettes, he wasn't supposed to collect nitrosamine levels.
That's correct.
And do you know whether or not this was communicated to Roger Combs?
I presume it was.
Do you know whether anyone after that ever collected nitrosamine levels on a production cigarette?
Not to my knowledge.
Did you?
Not to my knowledge.
Did anyone else in your presence do that?
Not that I'm aware of.
From a scientific standpoint, based on your experience as a scientist, does it make any sense to destroy that data that showed the Virginia Slim cigarette had 10 times the nitrosamine level of any of the non-production cigarettes?
Object to the former question.
From a scientific standpoint? No.
I'm asking you, why as a scientist, it doesn't make sense to you that that information would be destroyed?
No, it doesn't make sense to me why it was destroyed. No.
And as a scientist, what's the reason it doesn't make sense to you?
But the fact that the level was so much different from what we had been getting, it was of scientific interest to me to understand why and to study what was the cause of this increased level.
Once you knew that the nitrosamine level on a production cigarette was 10 times higher than on any non-production cigarette, did you have an opinion regarding whether or not the data collected on the non-production cigarettes was useful data? The data on nitrosamine level collected on the non-production cigarettes was useful data.
I think it was very useful data.
In what way was it useful?
It was useful in understanding how nitrosamines were formed.
Was it useful data in understanding the effect of nitrosamines on production cigarettes, or the impact of nitrosamines on production cigarettes?
Information that would be obtained on a non-production cigarette, I don't think would have any impact on understanding the production of nitrosamine on a production cigarette. They're completely different cigarettes.
Do you know whether the information collected on the nitrosamine level of non-production cigarettes was was ever used to imply in any way that it was equivalent to an actual test on a production cigarette?
Since we didn't have information on production cigarettes, I think the general assumption was that it was representative of what one would expect to obtain on a production cigarette.
And once you had done the test on the Virginia Slim cigarette, did that change in any way the assumption?
It did in my mind.
Do you know whether you were the only one of the scientists who were involved in the project who were of the opinion that that assumption now is questionable?
I have no basis to that. I would assume that other people, being scientists, could draw the same type of conclusion, but it wasn't discussed that I recall.
And when you were ordered to destroy the data on the Virginia Slims cigarette, what did you do?
Took the mammograms and the paper where I had tabulated or summarized the results and shredded it.
Was there a shredder available?
Yes.
Where were the shredders located?
There was a shredder on this. The nitrosamine project was on the 6th floor of the research tower. There was a shredder on that floor. There was a shredder, on the best of my knowledge, on essentially every floor and in every project, on every, in other buildings throughout research and development. Shredder was used quite frequently.
What type of data was usually shredded, if you know?
Generally, drafts of reports or memos. Say if you made a first draft and then it was changed or added to, you would, rather than just throw the first draft in the trash can, it would be shredded so that the information or the document would not go out into the trash and be subject to being picked up by someone who didn't have a need to know.
Did you ever again
You're on
test
highway, Fred.
an actual
Stop
production
it. Stop.
cigarette? Or a cigarette you just go and buy in a grocery store?
Nitrosamine?
Right.
But Council, do you recall where we were on that page?
What type of data was usually shredded, if you know?
Yep, right. Well, I got 47 of them. That's where the issue came up, page 47. Okay. All right. Okay, let's...
What type of data was usually shredded, if you know?
Generally, drafts of reports or memos. Say if you made a first draft and then it was changed or added to, you would, rather than just throw the first draft in the trash can, it would be shredded so that the information or the document would not go out into the trash and be subject to being picked up by someone who didn't have a need to know.
How frequently were you ordered to destroy and or shred data that you had collected on the nitrosamine levels of non-production cigarettes?
Never been asked to destroy.
Out of all the tests that you were involved in measuring the nitrosamine levels of cigarettes at Philip Morris, how many times did you destroy or shred all the notes concerning the Dow? Well, did you do it the one time?
Well, that one time,
Other than that one time, you didn't do it any other time ever?
no.
Did anyone ever tell you to do it, ever, other than the one time?
No.
Did you ever again test an actual production cigarette, or a cigarette you could just go and buy in a grocery store?
The nitrosamine?
Right.
Not to my knowledge.
Did anyone at Philip Morris ever again test a regular production cigarette that you could buy in a grocery store?
The nitrosamine? Not to my knowledge.
Speaking of time, let's start with the time period where...
Wait, why don't you stop it?
the
Stop the
Virginia
machine.
Slim cigarette. What
I
time
have to
period
back
was
up a
that?
little bit because we're not getting anywhere.
Bring the microphone down close to the speaker.
No, it's up, I guess, right, just to put it near where the volume is.
No, not too close. All right, let's see if that'll work.
It was in the fall of 1989.
Okay. And what do you base your recollection on?
Looking at my performance appraisals and the notes of the work that I had done that were noted in there on the work that I had done of when the chamber was actually started, built, and the initial runs were begun. And I knew that this was done shortly after that. So, and in reading those notes, the chamber was constructed, and we first started doing test studies in the second quarter of 1989. So, best of my recollection, it was probably within 6 months of that.
During that time period, who were the people that you can recollect that were in your hierarchy in research and development?
At that time, Al Warfield was the project leader. Robin Kinser was the section leader, or assistant manager, if you want to put it that way. Cathy Ellis was the manager. This was for the Biochemical Research Division. And Jim Charles was the director that Biochemical Research Division was under. And Ken Houghton was the vice president for research and development.
A person named Osdene, O-S-D-E-N-E.
Do I know him?
Mhm.
Yes, I do.
Who is he?
He was the director for research when I joined Philip Morris in 1972, and was my director. Over the years of my being there, they broke up the research division and made several directors, and he remained director of one of the divisions, and had moved, was always in a directory capacity most of the time that I was there. I might not have been reporting, I might not have been in his director. When I first joined the nitrosamine group, he was the director that the Biochemical Research Division fell under, because Jim Charles at that time was the manager. But then Jim Charles was promoted to director, and Dr. Osdene, I think at that time, became an assistant to the vice president for special projects or something along that line.
During the time you worked at Philip Morris, did you, whether it was by yourself or with the assistance of other scientists, ever discover a nitrosamine that had not been noted before in the literature?
Yes.
And how did that come about?
We were doing some studies in the side stream chamber on cigarettes that we utilized a experimental paper that was being developed to reduce the visibility of side stream smoke. There were two different approaches that they had come upon. One was an additive to a normal paper, and one was a double wrap paper of different densities. And in smoking those cigarettes and collecting the aged side stream smoke, I found a peak that didn't correspond with any of our known nitrosamines in our standards. And in doing further studies to try to confirm it, I concluded that it was a nitrosamine that had not been reported before.
And did you ever publish that data?
Internally?
Let's start with internally. Did you ever publish it internally?
In a formal report, no. It was reported in meetings.
And did any...
I will take this back. And I say formally, I mean a formal report. Now it was noted in things like monthly summaries in my notebook and things like that. And so it was reported in the notebook. It was when I found it and brought it to the attention of my management, they requested that I not refer to it as a new nitrosamine, but just refer to it as the retention time that it was observed on the chromatogram. So it was always referred to as like I forget what it's like, 8.5 peak or 8.7 peak, rather than saying new nitrosamine. And we contacted, when I found it and went to the management and talked about it, we also contacted our research facilities overseas to see if they had ever seen that. And the information we got back from the research facility in Switzerland was that they had noted it, but they just ignored it. They didn't pursue it.
From a standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, does it make sense just to ignore that?
Not to me, it doesn't.
And why doesn't it make sense to you?
Because being a scientist, to me, that's was quite interesting as to what would be the origin of it, especially since we were using a different construction parameter from what was what we normally been using. That what would be what it would be and what would be the cause for its formation. Because it had to have been produced only during the burning of the cigarette, because it wasn't there, it wasn't present in normal film.
Do you know whether that particular nitrosamine that you discovered, whether one way or the other, whether that is present in any cigarettes that exist today?
Not to my knowledge. It was only found in cigarettes with this particular paper on it, or these two particular papers. And to the best of my knowledge, those papers aren't in production on any cigarette. So I would assume that it's probably not.
Do you know whether or not there have been any changes in the contents of the Virginia Slim cigarette since your findings in fall of 1989?
I wouldn't have any knowledge of that.
Did anyone in your presence mention the possibility that maybe they needed to change some of the contents of the Virginia Slim cigarette after you made them aware of the nitrosamine level?
No. I requested that, I thought we should study that.
Who did you make that request to?
Robin Kinser.
When you say you requested you should study that, what were you requesting that be studied?
What the cause would be to produce this increased level. That understanding what the cause of it was could lead to a better understanding of how we could possibly lower nitrosamine levels. Because the mechanism of formation would be very important.
And when you made that request, what, if anything, was the response?
That we couldn't do it because we'd have to use production cigarettes. And we didn't do nitrosamine on production cigarettes.
So you wouldn't be able to make any effort to make the Virginia Slim cigarette safer because Philip Morris didn't, and I don't mean you, I mean the company, because Philip Morris didn't test production cigarettes.
I can't answer that when you use the word safer because I can't say that the level that was there was unsafe.
Do you know whether or not there is a safe level for nitrosamines in cigarette smoke?
I have read in the literature reports where they have limits have been set with respect to some food products because there are nitrosamines that are in nipples on baby bottles and in baby food and various things like that, and there have been levels that have been set for an upper limit for those nitrosamines, but those are not tobacco-specific nitrosamines. I don't know of any work where a level was actually set that was said to be a safe or unsafe level with respect to tobacco-specific nitrosamine.
And when you say tobacco-specific nitrosamine, what do you mean?
I'm referring to the nitrosamines NNN, NAT, and NNK that are formed from the alkaloids that are present in tobacco.
Do you know whether the amount of nitrosamine level, if it's possible to set a level for food, do you know whether it makes any difference what type of nitrosamine it is?
I don't recall from the literature whether they made a difference because they would be looking at things like dimethylnitrosamine or diethylnitrosamine or methylethyl or something along those lines, which we refer to as volatile nitrosamines, which are produced during smoking of cigarettes. But in mainstream smoke, they're effectively eliminated by the cellulose acetate filter. So they're removed. So those levels that are reported in the literature reflect in relation to food products. The best of my recollection that they were in the 10 to 20 parts per billion level.
Is it possible to reduce the nitrosamine level in a cigarette?
Yes.
And how do you know it's possible?
We developed methods to reduce it.
And how do you go about reducing the nitrosamine level in a cigarette?
you can reduce the alkaloid that's in the tobacco by an extraction process, which would remove one of the precursors to the formation of the photosynthetically formed nitrosamine. You could also, through an extraction process, reduce the preformed or endogenous nitrosamine, which would reduce levels that would go into smoke. And there are various extraction processes that could be used. And you could also treat filler by spraying onto it, say, ascorbic acid, and that would reduce the level of nitrosamines that were produced in mainstream smoke. I don't know about side stream. We didn't run any studies on side stream for that.
For reduction of nitrosamines?
For the ascorbic acid treatment. The others, once you remove them from the tobacco, obviously they couldn't be transferred to the mainstream or the side stream. But the treatments for with the spraying of the ascorbic acid, the best of my recollection, we only looked at the mainstream reduction.
Okay, so you know it's possible to remove nitrosamines from mainstream and secondhand smoke. Is that correct?
Yes.
And out of the attempts that have been made to do this, one of the attempts never actually dealt with the issue of side stream smoke, so you can't make a statement one way or the other on one of them, but the others you know. Is that correct?
The others we didn't actually measure in side stream smoke either, but when you remove the precursor, when you remove the nitrosamine from the filler, it obviously can't be transferred, and if you remove its precursor, it can't be formed during the combustion. So it would therefore lead to the fact that it wouldn't be in side stream.
As a scientist, and particularly a scientist who worked for Philip Morris, does it make sense to you for the company not to even make an attempt at trying to remove at least some of the nitrosamines in the Virginia Slim cigarette?
We developed methods for reduction of nitrosamines in smoke. They could be applied to, I presume, or any of their production products. If they chose to do it, I quite frankly don't have any evidence. I don't know whether they applied those methods to any of their products or not, except for one. That one product was the next product that was produced for the. It came from the ART process, from the alkaloid reduced tobacco. In the process of removing the nicotine, you also remove the nitrosamines, and the levels of nitrosamines in that particular cigarette were lower.
I guess. No, on the subject of nicotine, are you familiar with the term titrate? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right or not. I'm probably not. Is it? Did I?
That term titrate, yeah.
And what is that?
It would be a method by which you would achieve a certain level of a component in a substrate or
Were you involved involved in any efforts to at least attempt to do research on titration levels related to cigarette inhalation and or nicotine inhalation?
I was involved in some studies to determine there were developed procedures for the determination of nicotine retention as a function of various inhalation parameters. How deeply you inhale, how long you held the smoke in your lungs before you exhale. There was some evidence that indicated that changing your smoking parameters tended to change the level of retention of those smoke components.
In layperson's terms, what does that mean?
In the early 80s, there were some studies that were done with regards to what we refer to as a full-flavored cigarette or a Marlboro type cigarette, which delivered, say, 15 milligrams of tar and a milligram of nicotine. And then there were studies that were done with cigarettes that were highly filtered, which delivered, like a Cambridge, which maybe only delivered 1.5 milligrams of tar and 1/10 of a milligram of nicotine. And people that smoked those cigarettes, the low delivery cigarettes, tended to smoke them differently than people who smoked a higher delivery cigarette. They would tend to take a larger puff more frequently, inhale it deeper, and hold it in longer.
Do you know whether they'd also tend to smoke more cigarettes under those circumstances?
They did tend to smoke. And that was the ultimate goal was, if we could determine that, was to see if the change in a person's smoking habit or parameter, as they changed from one cigarette to another, if they were tending to smoke in such a manner to maintain a certain level of nicotine. That was the goal. I developed the analytical technique for measuring the amount of nicotine that was absorbed as a function of the way a person smoked, but we never, the project was terminated at that point, so we never actually did the test on various subjects to determine what the actual rate of or amount of nicotine absorption was corresponded with the way a person smoked.
Approximately what year was that?
81 or 82, somewhere in that general range.
Do you know who made the decision to terminate the project?
No. I know who her manager was.
Jan Jones?
Bill Jones' manager.
Who was that?
Bill Dunn. And that his director was Tom Osdeen. But he made...
And the research that you proposed that was not done, it was turned down, would that research, in your opinion, have contributed in any way toward finding the answers to those questions that are apparently answered in this article, which is Plaintiff's Exhibit 6?
Experiments were designed to try to determine if this was what was happening, or if this is the way people smoked. Yes. Would have confirmed that.
Do you know whether or not Philip Morris conducted any research involving mouse skin painting?
I've heard that they did.
And how did you hear that they did?
Through discussions that were carried on at Philip Morris.
What was the nature of those discussions that were carried on at Philip Morris?
Well, they had developed a group to do biological activity studies using an Ames assay, and the word or the information that was made available to me through discussions was that the results that they were obtaining for the Ames assay tests were equivalent to the results they had obtained from the mouse skin painting test with relation to the biological activity of the smoke samples they were testing.
And by biological activity, what do you mean?
In the Ames assay, it would be the inhibition of the growth of the salmonella cells. In mouse skin painting, it would be the production of some physiological response to it, say the development of a tumor or.
And what individuals were involved in those studies, if you know? Any of them?
It was my understanding that the studies were done in Europe, in Germany, on the mouse skin painting. And I think the initial tests of the development of the Ames assay were developed there also. And the person that was coordinating that work at Philip Morris was Jim Charles and Tom Husney.
And do you know if any of their findings were published?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know.
Do you know any of the results of that research?
Only what I stated, that they actually had a program there here in Richmond at the research facility where they were doing the Ames assay studies, and that the results that they were getting were equivalent to the results that they got from the mouse skin painting.
IMBIFO. IMBIFO.
MB? MB.
Or
I'm familiar with NB folk.
NB folk.
IM, and it's IN.
it's IN? Okay, what is that?
It's a research facility in Cologne, Germany.
And what kind of research does that facility do, if you know?
They do chemical and biological research.
Is it a Philip Morris facility?
Yes, it is.
Do you know what any of the results of their research was or is?
Well, overwhelming is to be too
What I
vague.
stated just then about the mouse skin painting and stuff, I understand that it was done there. But
Did you ever see any publications related to any of the research done at that facility?
no.
Do you know whether any of the research at that facility was ever published?
No. Now, when you say published, I assume that you mean in the open literature.
I mean in the open literature, you're correct.
knowledge of it.
Do you know what the purpose of the research was? Do you have an hypothesis of what the answer would have been had you done the research?
I have a hypothesis, yes.
What is that?
That we would have found that people would have, if they took larger puffs and inhaled it deeper, held it longer, they would absorb more nicotine. That the preliminary results that Jan had obtained, which indicated that that's the way people were tending to smoke when they went from high delivery cigarettes to low delivery cigarettes. The conclusion, I believe, would have been that people tended to titrate themselves to a certain level of nicotine.
Were you ever told to edit scientific reports to omit reference to subjects that might be considered sensitive?
Can you be more specific about sensitive?
Might have a tendency to show or indicate that cigarettes or cigarette smoke may be harmful to those who consume the product either voluntarily or involuntarily.
We were instructed not to include references to potential health effects in our reports on discussion of results. And we were told the reason for that was that we were not measuring or not studying the health effects. We were only reporting the data that we collected as far as concentrations of the particular component that we measured. So therefore, that's the only thing we should report.
Were you ever told not to type reports about side stream smoke studies that you were doing?
Not to type them?
Not to type reports, not to prepare reports about side stream smoke studies that you were doing?
There were a couple of studies that I did that I was requested to only transfer information verbally or in an handwritten form, yes.
And who, if you recall, made those requests to you?
My manager and assistant manager.
And approximately what year or years did that occur?
Over several times over the course of the time that I was working in the nitrosamine project.
And who were your managers at the time this occurred?
At one time, the manager that happened, I think, was Ted Sanders, and the director was Jim Charles. That would have been in the mid-'80s. And then at a later date, I believe the manager was either Cathy Ellis, and the director would have been Jim Charles, or the manager was Richard Karchman, and the director was Cathy Ellis.
Do you recall specifically any of the content of those reports you were told not to prepare? You can answer.
I recall that one of them was with reference to studies of volatile nitrosamines in side stream smoke.
And by volatile nitrosamines in side stream smoke, what do you mean?
Side stream and mainstream smoke.
And when you say volatile nitrosamines in side stream and mainstream smoke, what do you mean?
talking about the non-tobacco specific nitrosamines such as dimethylnitrosamine and nitrosopyrrolidine.
And do you recall whether the levels were higher than 20 nanograms?
I don't recall.
Do you have an opinion as to why you were asked not to prepare those reports?
An opinion as to why I was asked? I was just asked to do the study and to keep it confidential and to not put the data in my normal notebook, but to record it in a special notebook which is issued to me, and to report the information directly to my managing director. It was the best that I can recall now, it was a study that was to try to duplicate results that they had obtained from somewhere else. And we were just doing the study to confirm whether the information was correct or not.
Do you know where the other study came from that they were attempting to duplicate?
No, I don't.
Do you know whether Philip Morris ever attempted to duplicate studies done by researchers outside of the tobacco industry?
Yes, they did.
And do you know whether they were able to successfully duplicate any studies that were done outside the tobacco industry that were related to tobacco?
Yes, they were.
What studies do you know of that they were able to duplicate?
Various, we have a protocol for our collection methods and our sample preparation or workup methods and our analysis methods. And occasionally people at either a university or somewhere like, say, the American Health Foundation or some non-tobacco facility would publish a paper indicating that, that they had an improved method for the analysis, and we would duplicate as close as we could that particular procedure to see if it was really an improvement over the method that we were using.
And if it was an improvement, what would happen?
If it was an improvement, we would have probably adopted it to our use.
How would you characterize the resources that were made available to you as a scientist to carry out research requested by Philip Morris?
I would characterize them as being very good. We always had the best that was available.
Did the cost of the equipment or personnel to your knowledge prevent Philip Morris from doing research that they, the company, wanted to do?
I don't know. I couldn't answer that because I don't know what they might have turned down. All I know is that we requested improved instrumentation or the necessity for expertise in the way of a consultant, and we could justify it, then it was usually provided to us.
What was the reason given for not allowing you and Jan Jones to implement your project related to the use of the vest to measure inhalation patterns?
wasn't given a reason.
And approximately what year did that occur?
In the early 80s, 81, 82, when that was.
Okay, now you left the company in sometime in 1992. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Approximately what month was that?
I left in July of 1992.
And why did you leave?
I was fired.
When you say, do you have an opinion as to the reason you were fired?
I was told that the project was being transferred overseas and I no longer had a job.
What project?
The nitrosamine project.
Prior to the time you were told you no longer had a job, had you received any unsatisfactory work evaluations?
No, I hadn't. The environmental tobacco smoke, the NNK levels in the side stream chamber. I was working on the complete identification of the unknown nitrosamine that we had that I discovered with the low visibility side stream papers, and was also one of the last little projects I was working on was a project that Cathy Ellis had asked me to do with relationship to the possibility that the absorption of caprolactam in the filler that was produced down at the Park 500 might be related to the new nitrosamine that we were observing.
To your knowledge, did the investigations the investigations involving environmental tobacco smoke and NNK levels continue after you left?
In the age side stream? Is that what you asked?
In the age side stream or in any investigation related to environmental tobacco smoke and NNK level?
I was told that when I was let go that several people on the project would remain on until approximately the end of the year 1992 to tie up some loose ends on some projects that were being done.
And then what was going to happen up to the end of the year 1992?
That's when the project would be transferred over to Switzerland.
Do you know whether that research was in fact transferred over to Switzerland?
I was told by some people that worked on the project that it was.
Who told you it was?
Can't call his name right now. I forgot.
What was the nature of the investigation that you were conducting of environmental tobacco smoke and NNK level at the time, at or around the time you were terminated?
The primary part that I was working on at that time was the identification of the new nitrosamine that I had discovered. The actual determining its chemical formula and structure.
What, if any, work were you doing on the investigation of environmental tobacco smoke and NNK level?
Do you think that?
What investigation were you doing, or what was your involvement in any investigation of environmental tobacco smoke and NNK level?
I don't know how to answer that. It's vague. Can you rephrase it a different way?
it down. Were you doing any investigations in 1992 related in any way to environmental tobacco smoke?
The aged side stream smoke, which I guess you could refer to as environmental tobacco smoke, that I was doing with relationship to the low visibility side stream papers and the identification of the unknown component, or unknown nitrosamine that I had found. I was doing that. In the course of those studies, we were measuring NNK, but the primary concern was identifying the unknown nitrosamine. And if I might return back to a previous question, the fellow's name was Bob Forte, that had told me that the project was transferred to Switzerland.
And who was he?
He was a chemist with the nitrosamine project.
Did anyone at Philip Morris express any concern about the quality of your work prior to your termination?
In my performance appraisals, it was always referred to as being of high quality, and that I was also told verbally by my managers and my section leaders and project leaders that I was doing very good work.
Morgan, I introduced myself earlier. I'm Greg Fowler. I'm here representing Philip Morris. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
Good. A couple of rules of the road.
All right. This is a good time to take our break. It's starting into the cost.
Feel free to let me know. We'll take a break when you want it. Secondly, if I ask you a question that is vague, you don't understand it, for whatever reason you can't answer it, let me know and I'll rephrase it. We'll try to get an answer that way. Will you do that for me? Okay, good. Are you suffering under any physical or mental conditions currently that would make it difficult or impossible for you to understand the questions I ask or to formulate truthful answers to those questions and make those?
No, I'm not.
Have you, in the past, or are you currently suffering under any mental or physical conditions?
I have an anxiety problem that I take medication for.
What's the nature of the anxiety problem?
It's referred to as endogenous anxiety, which is also has affiliated with it some agoraphobia.
What's agoraphobia?
It's fear of being in public places, and also other phobias that are associated with it, where I've had anxiety attacks before. Say if I were in a restaurant or whatever, and I had an anxiety attack in that restaurant, I would maybe have a phobia of returning to that particular restaurant.
What triggers anxiety attacks in you?
It's as referred to me by my doctor, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and I think related to serotonin, and it's not really what I think. It's treated mostly by psychiatrists, but it's more of a physiological disorder, such as diabetes, because it can be triggered by lactic acid. So if I were to be given an injection or a dose of lactic acid, it could trigger an attack. So
can a stressful event trigger an attack?
I guess it's possible, yeah.
But it hasn't in you, as far as you're aware?
It may have. I can't really say.
Mm-hmm. How long have you been under medication for that condition?
Probably for maybe 15 years or more.
So if my math is right, it's 1997, so since approximately 1982?
Early 80s, yeah.
Okay. So prior to changing jobs at Philip Morris and going over to the Biochemical Research Division, correct? Do the medications have any side effects?
Some do, some don't.
So you're on different medications, is that right?
Currently, I'm on just one regime, medication regime. But over the years, I have tried different medications to see which one worked best. Because of some of the side effects, some would make you drowsy, some would make you hyper, that type of reaction.
What medications were you on in the late 1980s?
Probably Klonopin, and I may have still been taking some Ativan at that time, but both are benzodiazepine as far as the class of drug. And
What side effects would those drugs have?
various ones have different side effects.
Those two drugs that you were taking in the late 1980s, what side effects would they have?
They depend on the individual.
With you?
They seem to work fairly well. That's the reason I was taking them. The benzodiazepine class of compounds also includes Valium, Xanax, various other. There's a whole host of them, and some of them would, like I say, would produce the increased level of anxiety, and some would produce too much sedation or make you drowsy.
Okay, so how about those two that you were taking in the late 1980s? What were their side effects in you?
Effectively minimal.
Drowsiness?
Not a noticeable amount. No.
Okay. Would they have any impact upon your ability to assess a situation, understand what was going on, et cetera, et cetera?
No.
No.
Not to my knowledge.
Were you under the care of a psychiatrist in the late 1980s then?
Yes, it would.
Okay. So in the late 1980s, you're under the care of a psychiatrist and you're being medicated for, what would you call it, a psychiatric condition at that time. Is that correct?
It was classified as that because I was being treated by a psychiatrist.
Okay. Did your condition require extensive medical leave from work?
I took a medical leave of absence in 1990 because I was having, I guess you might say I had an acute attack of anxiety, and was out from for 4.5 months, from June to the middle of October.
And that was in 1990?
Yes.
Do you know how early? I'm sorry, I missed the dates in 1990.
It was in early to middle June till about the middle of October. I have the records from Philip Morris on the approval of my medical leave of absence and my return to work, if you want.
Okay, let me get back to that, but it's not necessary at this point. The symptomology that required you to take the medical leave in 1990, when did that begin to manifest itself?
When?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I just came on very sudden.
So you were employed. Let me just ask a couple more questions. Did the anxiety condition itself have any impact on your ability to assess situations as they occurred, accurately, perceive what was going on in your surroundings, anything of that variety?
I don't believe so.
Okay. You were with Philip Morris for approximately 20 years, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And if we could switch, let me just hand you this group of exhibits, and if we could just switch over to, I think it's exhibit number 2, which is the curriculum vitae and the resume. Do you have that there?
Yes,
citation, I think on the third page, on work experience February 1984 to the present.
Third page?
I might be...
First,
Is it the first page?
the first page of the resume.
Okay, that has your work experience from February 84 to the present.
February 84?
Do you happen to see a summary of your work experience from February of 1984 to the present in the documents you're reviewing?
No.
Let me just read this to you and see if this begins to describe some of the work that you're doing. And I'm quoting, initiated, planned, and conducted studies related to the origin, identification, and quantification of subtrace components of proprietary interest in tobacco and tobacco smoke, including ETS. Is that an accurate description of some of the things you were doing from 1984 through your completion of employment at Philip Morris in 1992?
Yes.
And when you talk about the quantification of subtrace components, what components would you be referring to?
Nitrosamines.
And what does subtrace mean?
It's just a general reference to, I think, generally in analytical chemistry, if you're referring to levels down into parts per million, and maybe a little bit higher, you would call them trace levels. If you're talking about sub-part per million, part per billion, or maybe even part per trillion, you would call them subtrace.
So when we're talking about TSNAs, or just tobacco-specific nitrosamines in tobacco smoke, whether it's a side stream smoke or mainstream smoke, we're talking about extremely minute levels, aren't we?
We're talking about parts per billion, yes.
Parts per billion. Because of the very small number of those components in cigarette smoking, is it difficult to collect and measure those components?
Difficult?
Yes.
No.
Is it easy?
It wasn't as easy as doing some experiments, but it wasn't what I would consider difficult.
You need sophisticated equipment,
You need specialized equipment, yes.
and the margin of error is very small with that sophisticated equipment, is it not?
I don't know what you mean on margin of error.
The smallest variation in procedures could throw off the numbers in a meaningful way. Is that correct, in using that sort of machinery?
Well, there's a lot of steps. There's your collection step, which has an error level associated with it. Then there's the extraction from the device you collected it in, and it's worked up in concentration, which can have an error associated with it. And then there's the actual instrumental part where you actually analyze the concentration in the prepared sample, which has a margin of error. And I would say that the instrumental part of it is probably the most precise.
And in this section that I've read, you say subtrace components of proprietary interest. And so you're describing there that Philip Morris would have proprietary interest in the TSNA work that you were doing, correct? You said yes, correct?
Yes.
It was never your role at Philip Morris to evaluate the health effects, if any, of environmental tobacco smoke, was it?
No, it wasn't.
And if your role to evaluate the health effects of any of nitrosamines in smoke, whether it be environmental tobacco smoke, side stream smoke, or mainstream smoke, correct?
No, it wasn't.
And you're not qualified to offer expert opinions on those topics, are you?
I have a knowledge of what's published in the literature, and I can offer opinions on that. As far as ever doing any experiments on health effects, I've never had, no.
You're not an expert in mouse skin painting, are you?
No, I'm not.
Not an expert in Ames assays, are you?
No, I'm not.
You're not an expert in human smoking behavior, are you?
No, I'm not.
And specifically, you're not an expert in the nicotine titration hypothesis, are you?
Being an expert in a hypothesis is kind of a contradiction in terms.
It's really not. Are you an expert in nicotine titration theories?
I'm an expert in, I could class myself as being an expert in developing analytical procedures that could determine or support a hypothesis.
But you're not an expert in the literature that deals with the nicotine titration hypothesis, are you?
It's not published in the literature. I never published anything in the literature.
Right. But are you aware of the body of literature on the nicotine titration hypothesis?
I'm aware of some of it, yes.
But not all of it.
I doubt that I've read it all.
How many articles would you say you've read on it?
Wouldn't hazard a guess.
You don't know it. Are you an expert in carcinogenesis?
No, I'm not.
Are you an expert in tobacco-specific nitrosamine related carcinogenesis?
No, I'm not.
Are you an expert in nitrosamine carcinogenesis?
No, I'm not.
You'd agree with me, wouldn't you, that the scientists that you worked with at Philip Morris were highly qualified, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir.
And you would agree with me that the work done by yourself and others in Philip Morris's research and development area was good science, wouldn't you?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that the work that you did at Philip Morris, as well as the work that was done generally in R&D, or research and development at Philip Morris, was well supported, correct?
Supported in which way?
With regard to equipment provided,
Yes.
with regard to working space provided,
Yes.
with regard to resources generally.
Yes.
And like you had said a few minutes ago on direct examination, when you asked for resources or consultants or equipment, what have you, you got it if you could justify it, correct?
That's correct.
Now, there might be all sorts of reasons why Philip Morris would choose not to approve research requests, no matter how ardently the proponent of that request might have held it. Isn't that true?
That's true.
Could be just a simple question of priorities, couldn't it?
That's possible.
It could be a question of money, couldn't it?
It's possible.
It could be that Philip Morris chooses not to conduct certain research because it's already well enough established in the external literature, correct?
That's possible.
It could be that Philip Morris would choose not to approve requested research for the reason that it wasn't sufficiently business related, correct?
That's possible.
Did you consider Philip Morris a good place to work?
Yes, I did.
Did you consider the assignments and the work that you did challenging,
Yes.
interesting?
Yes.
Do you have any animosity today towards Philip Morris?
No, I don't.
Any animosity toward any of Philip Morris's current or former employees?
No, I don't.
Now, we're going to switch over to your CV. I believe that's been one of the things that's been marked as an exhibit there in number 2. Is it accurate to say that while you were at Philip Morris, you published 2 papers in the outside literature and the available scientific literature that related to the work that you were doing at Philip Morris?
That's correct.
Also be correct to say that you made 6 presentations concerning the work that you did at Philip Morris to groups that were open to the general public.
Did I actually present myself, or was I just a co-author to the presentation?
Either presenter or was a co-author.
6 years.
Okay. Those were, with regard to those 6 publications, I'm sorry, the 6 presentations and the 2 publications, those were on scientific topics, correct?
They were on, yes, they were on scientific things.
They were important scientific topics, were they not?
To me, they were, yes.
And they were based upon work that you had done at Philip Morris, correct?
Yes.
Philip Morris allowed you to make those presentations and publish those publications, correct?
Yes, they did.
They encouraged you to do it, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
And
How would they add? That in the early part of my tenure at Philip Morris, from 72 probably on until the early 80s, Philip Morris encouraged you to take about 20 to 25% of your time and work outside of your assigned area of research, such that you could become involved with what other people were doing, expand your knowledge of other things that were going on in the company, and develop expertise, and also to follow ideas that you might have, and they encourage that. And as far as the studies with Jan Jones, that's how I got involved, and that's how that time was allocated.
And Philip Morris's interest in that was to make you a better scientist, a more rounded scientist, correct?
That's correct.
And to make Philip Morris a better company scientifically by allowing that interaction across disciplines, correct?
That's correct.
Now, I noticed that in some of the publications and presentations you had co-authors from the company. You had Jerry Whidbey as a co-author, correct?
That's correct.
Good scientist, Jerry Whidbey?
Excellent, Senator.
Okay. How about Tom Osdeen? He was a co-author on some of those presentations or papers. Was he a good scientist?
I would presume he was. He was already a director when I joined Philip Morris, so he was not actually working at the bench and publishing papers. He was drawing from the work that others had done and would present them at meetings. So I had no way of really evaluating his scientific knowledge, or scientific ability at the bench. His knowledge of science, I would judge as being very good.
What about Vicky Baliga? Am I saying that right? B-A? Vicky Baliga, would you consider her a good scientist?
Yes, I would.
Now, you had some pre-Philip Morris publications and presentations, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And those were for the same purpose, to share scientific information with the external community, correct?
That's correct.
And if I didn't ask you this before, I apologize. The publications and presentations that you made based upon work you had done at Philip Morris, that was for the purpose of sharing information with the external community, scientific community, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the same is true for these pre-Philip Morris publications and presentations. You were sharing information with your colleagues in the scientific community, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
I will go back and make an addition to one of the presentations, which was presentation number 4, which was to the College of William and Mary Graduate Seminar Series.
Yes, sir.
That referred to the nucleomagnetic resonance work that I did when I was in graduate school. But the purpose of getting involved with that program was to have an interaction with the external scientific community and with the people at William and Mary.
Very good. Very good. The pre-Philip Morris publications and presentations involved Don Layden, correct?
That's correct.
In other words, he was a co-author and a co-presenter with you on some of those endeavors, correct?
That's correct.
And Don Layden, another good scientist, was he?
Very good scientist.
And when you met Don Layden, where was he?
He was my major professor when I was in graduate school.
And did John Layton eventually become an employee of Philip Morris?
Yes, he did.
And the work that he did at Philip Morris continued to be excellent as it was before he was a Philip Morris employee, correct?
That's correct.
Before your deposition here today, did you have any meetings, telephone conferences, or other contact with anybody from the Rosenblatt law firm?
With regards to testimony?
With regard to your employment at Philip Morris, with regard to this deposition or anything of that variety?
Mr. Hogue called me and identified who he was and wanted to talk to me. I told him I had counsel. I referred him to Mr. Ryan, and I had no more contact with him.
So you didn't discuss the nature of your expected testimony or anything like that with anybody from Stanley Rosenblatt's office before Mr. Hogue started asking you questions earlier today, is that correct?
That's correct.
And nobody from that office showed you or provided to you documents or anything to review in advance?
No, they didn't.
And you never reviewed any such documents that were provided, or any such documents that were provided by Mr. Rosenblatt's office. Is that correct? Let me ask you a few questions, if I can, please, about the smoking vest project. That was primarily Jan Jones' project, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you provided some technical assistance in developing some methodologies, is that correct?
Yes, she was developing the vest for studying just the way, to be able to measure the way people, their smoking patterns, inhalation patterns. And she had asked me if I would help her with some of the early tests on the vest and just testing it out. And which I did. I guess you could say I might have been a model.
And you were a subject of...
Our subject, yes. And I wore it for comfort and also, you know, wore it to test how accurately it measured inhalation parameters, because she had an instrument there that you could, she would say, take a certain size puff and draw it deep into your lungs, and it would measure the volume that you took, and you know, so and she would correlate that with what she was measuring on her instrumentation.
But you didn't smoke any cigarettes while you were wearing the vest, did you?
No, I didn't.
Did you see any results of experimentation that she did to see whether people who were smoking the vest were generating data and results that were, to her, valid and interpretable?
I know that she had people that smoked cigarettes for her, and that she had done some measurements, and she had told me of some of the results that she had obtained.
But you didn't see those results, did you?
Not that I can recall, translated in any form. No.
But you knew of those because I think you said earlier you were a social friend, you worked on her floor for a bit, and you were a subject in the in some of the preliminary trials, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is it your sworn testimony that this smoking vest was completely ready to go and to test the parameters that were suggested by the study that was requested?
In my opinion, that it was fully developed and ready to, yes.
And on what do you base that?
I based it as far as the vest itself and her ability to, and it, what she had developed and its ability to measure inhalation parameters, so that she said that it was fully developed. As far as the part that I was going to do with the collection of the inhaled nicotine and exhaled nicotine and calculating nicotine retention, I judge that to be fully developed and ready to go.